Right, this video will cover some basics from Chapter 13 on predation and herbivory. Again, we're going to go into some modeling equations and looking at predation, predator-prey interactions, for instance. But in this video, I'd like to cover some basics of predation and herbivory, look at what the general differences are between predators and herbivores, also what kinds of adaptations organisms have to prevent being eaten, because that's not very conducive to survival. So we'll be looking at that, and we'll end with a little bit of a discussion of how predation and herbivory are linked with evolution. Okay, so if you don't photosynthesize or chemosynthesize, then you have to eat stuff. Humans fall into this category, but so do about half of the species on Earth. They need to feed on another organism. So when you feed on another organism, that organism is suffering for your benefit, essentially. So these are what are called exploitation interactions, or plus-minus interactions. So the one doing the eating is benefiting, and the one getting eaten is not. So individuals will feed on other individuals and harm them. There are three different types of feeding that can occur. Herbivores will eat tissue of either living plants or algae. Predators will eat other organisms called their prey. And parasites will live either in or on another organism called their host and feed on parts of it. Now, the big difference between a parasite and a predator is that predator tends to kill the organism that it's eating, and a parasite generally does not kill its host. Also, a predator tends to have multiple prey, whereas a parasite tends to feed off of one, typically larger host. We're going to be mostly focusing on herbivores and predators in this chapter. Predators tend to have fairly broad diets. They tend to not specialize. Now, there are, of course, exceptions to this of predators that only eat on one or a very few number of different species, but most predators have fairly large diets. And what they end up doing is this really interesting behavior called prey switching. And this is where they will essentially eat whatever is most abundant in the area that they're in. So here's an example of a study looking at guppies and what they're feeding on. And when a species is pretty rare in their environment, they actually feed on it at a less than proportional ratio. But when a certain prey item is fairly common, they will feed on it at a higher rate. And they'll do what's kind of called, so they'll switch between one prey to another. So as soon as prey becomes rare, they'll switch to a different species. And we'll talk about this later on in terms of why species might survive as the result of predator-prey, and we'll look at this in more detail in class. And it actually is very much related to why biodiversity is increased through some predator-prey interactions. Herbivores, on the other hand, tend to specialize. They tend to specialize in certain parts of an organism. So there are three kind of main parts to a plant, for instance: the leaves, the stems, and the roots. Now, a large herbivore might eat the whole plant, but most are going to specialize on one or another of these parts. And now, the large majority of species are probably going to feed on leaf tissue, mostly because leaf tissue has a higher nitrogen content than anything else. And animals do need nitrogen to help them make things like amino acids that help them make proteins. So you'll notice that in animal tissue, nitrogen content is very high. In seeds, nitrogen content is also very high, and it's also fairly high in various kinds of leaves, where there's angiosperm or gymnosperm, so broadleaf or kind of evergreen leaves. Whereas in things like sap or stems or roots, the nitrogen content is much lower. In addition to specializing on certain parts of a plant, most herbivores also specialize on certain species of plants, and they might only feed on one particular species. So they're going to be what's called a specialist. Well, there's good reasons for this, and we'll talk about plant defenses against herbivory later on. And that's one of the major differences, is that plants often will develop these special responses to herbivory, in large part because they can't run away from a predator, so they have to be able to fight. And those defenses make it difficult for species to eat them. So in response, the prey, or the predators, or herbivores in this case, will develop mechanisms for overcoming those defenses, and so they become very specialized over time on one or just a few species. So we tend to see lots of specialists. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't generalist herbivores, and there are. So, for instance, grasshoppers, deer, a lot of large browsers are more generalists, and they might feed on a wide range of things, but the large majority of herbivores tend to specialize. Okay, so organisms eat other animals, organisms eat plants. They themselves, while they're obtaining food, have to avoid becoming food. So when predators first appeared, so the first organisms on Earth were photosynthesizers, and they didn't have to worry about predation or herbivory. But about 530 million years ago, predators started to come about, and they were organisms that didn't photosynthesize and rather consumed organisms as food. When that happened, then evolution favored defenses such as armor or spines or other mechanisms that would lessen the chance that an individual gets eaten. So I find that these are really interesting to look at in terms of the variety of different adaptations there are on Earth. And so I'd like to cover a few examples of adaptations that animals and plants develop that lessen their chance of being eaten. So there are several different classes of adaptations. The first class are physical defenses. So some individuals just grow really large. So elephants are gigantic. And so very few organisms are large enough to actually take down an elephant. So elephants are fairly vulnerable when they're young, but even then they're pretty large. And by the time they're full grown, there's very few predators that will be able to attack an elephant. They may be more vulnerable to things like disease or bacteria than they are to predation. Gazelles use speed, and lots of organisms use speed. They're very fast. They can run away from their predators that are chasing them, and they're able to outrun them. And then some that are not so fast have body armor. So for instance, this pangolin, the ground pangolin, on the upper right, the turtle, the pufferfish here, they all have some kind of spines or shell or scales that make it difficult for a predator to actually eat them. So that's body armor. Another thing that organisms can do is they might have coloration that helps them to deter predation. There are some individuals that have bright colors that make them stand out, but also provide a warning to potential predators. This is called aposematic coloration. And they typically also have some kind of chemical defense or toxin within their body tissue that means that if a predator does eat them, the predator is likely to get sick. So their coloration warns predators not to eat them because they're going to make them sick. The opposite of aposematic would be crypsis coloration, and these are prey that have colors that blend them in. So on the right here we have what's called a katydid, and they look very similar to a plant, even a plant that has a little bite taken out of it. And on the bottom left is a pygmy seahorse, which blends in very well with the coral that it's surrounded by. Now, some have coloration that makes them look like something they're not. So it's called mimicry. So this is a flatworm, but it has coloration that resembles a poisonous snake, a coral snake. This makes predators think twice before going after them because they've learned to avoid that coloration pattern based on aposematic coloration of perhaps a poisonous snake, but they will then also avoid this flatworm, which really poses no threat to them, but due to mimicry, it helps avoid predation by looking like something that's more toxic than it is. Individuals also have behaviors. Now, we talked about some behaviors like this back in the behavior chapter, but behaviors are an adaptation to avoid getting eaten. So things like staying in sheltered areas or keeping lookouts like these meerkats here, forming defensive circles like muskoxen, having other defensive behaviors and group behaviors that allow them to avoid being preyed upon. One really interesting behavior-related defense is what cicadas do. There are these species of several species of cicada, which are called 13 or 17-year cicadas, and what they do is they actually reproduce only at one point, one very short point, every 13 or 17 years, depending on the species. It's called synchronous production of progeny. They will all emerge, live for a few weeks, and reproduce. They will lay their eggs. The eggs will hatch about 6 to 10 weeks later, and then the nymphs will burrow underground and live for 13 or 17 years before they finally emerge as adults to breed. So they're only around for a few weeks every 13 to 17 years. When they do emerge, lots of them are eaten, but there's so many that come out at that same time that predators cannot possibly eat all of them or even a large portion of them. Predators are so full up on cicada that the majority of the cicadas do not have to deal with predators at all. So they essentially sacrifice a portion of their population so that the rest of the population can reproduce. Now, we've been talking about a lot of animal defenses. Plants also have defenses. Now, one, they might do similar to the predator satiation. They do what's called masting, which is producing large number of seeds in some years and maybe none in others. And this prevents all of their seeds from being eaten. And so years that they produce a large number of seeds, some of them will be eaten, yes, but a number of them will not, or will be lost or forgotten about or hidden by animals. So some rely on things like squirrels to bury their seeds and not make it back to several of them. They might also have growth responses, so they get eaten and that stimulates growth or flower production. Maybe the being eaten by a predator stimulates them to reproduce because they're under stress. Plants also have defenses called constitutive defenses or induced defenses, where they will produce these defenses in response to an attack, which would be an induced defense, or they will have defenses that are always present that prevent certain kinds of herbivory. And I'll show you some videos in class related to these different kinds of defense mechanisms, but we'll talk about a few of them here. So induced defenses have the benefit of not wasting resources when the plant is not under attack, but they have the disadvantage that they are only produced when the plant's already under attack, and they may at that point be too late. Okay. So thinking about this at a broader scale, what are different strategies that organisms have? Well, they might have some kind of mechanical defense like thorns or sticky hair or silica. These plants have these defenses that prevent their tissue from being torn, prevent animals from being able to eat large amounts of material. They may have chemical defenses, so similar to those animal having toxins, they might actually have defenses that either make them not taste very good or make herbivores sick after eating them. They might actually have mutualisms, which we'll talk about in a future chapter, where they will have a relationship with other organisms like wolves or acacia do with ants to help defend them. They may also grow in areas that allow them to have mutual kind of defense with a neighboring plant. And the fifth one, which is really interesting, and hopefully we'll talk about this a little bit more in class, is semiochemicals. So what this is they actually will mimic things like hormones that are found in animals. So there's certain plants that actually produce a hormone that, when consumed by insects, cause the insect to molt, and immediately it starts to stop thinking about eating and start thinking about its own defense because it's lost its exoskeleton. So kind of crazy things that these plants can have. Now, some kind of crazy adaptations that we see in some animals, just to give you a taste of different things that might happen. On the top left is what's called a decorator crab. They actually go around and collect material from the seafloor and place it on top of themselves, and they can be completely covered in things like algae. I've actually collected some decorator crabs thinking that they were algae, and they're simply some algae growing on a decorator crab. The top right is a ant called Camponotus saunders, or also known as the exploding ants. What they do is they essentially self-destruct when they're being preyed upon, spraying this toxic, poisonous goo all over the predator. This allows all their brothers and sisters to escape predation, get back to, mainly sisters, get back to the nest, and avoid being preyed upon. The bottom left is a sea cucumber and is expelling a portion of its digestive tract. And this one confuses, but also interferes with the predator and may drive the predator to leave. And then on the bottom right are honeybees, and what they do is they will surround and mob their predator, and they vibrate their muscles at such a high rate that they increase the temperature and essentially cook the predator from within that scrum. However, for every defense that an organism has, there are often predators that will learn to overcome them. So this is an example here. This is what's called a lubber grasshopper, and they are toxic. When they're fresh, they cause predators to get really sick, and this bird, if it ate a live grasshopper, would probably get sick and vomit. But loggerhead shrikes here have learned to impale the grasshoppers and wait until the toxin has degraded, and then they'll feed on it at a later date. So you may see these grasshoppers stuck on things like barbed wire. Similarly, here is a plant defense that's being circumnavigated by a cabbage loper caterpillar. It's digging a trench, allowing the fluid that would have defended the plant to ooze out of the leaf, drain from the leaf tissue, and then it will eat the leaf after it's drained it of that defense. Now, what we tend to see is a relationship between predator or herbivore and their prey in terms of evolutionary response. So the development of any defense, a plant defense or an animal defense, is usually then followed by development of a mechanism to overcome that defense by the herbivore or the predator, and then followed by, again, another defense. So here's kind of a timeline for herbivore plant response. So first the plant synthesizes a defense in response to herbivory. At first it works and the animal avoids it, but a few species then adapt to that and herbivory increases. So the plant develops a second defense. You get decreased herbivory and avoidance, followed by adaptation, and the cycle continues and continues. And this is something called coevolution, which we've looked at in the past, but it happens in response to herbivory and predation as well.